Hello, welcome back. My name is Daniel Okkeloen and I'm going to talk a little bit about the overheating problems on the Sony ZV-E1. I promised in the title that this is a fix for it, and I don't think that's actually true within limits, but I figured if I don't make this video now and I wait until much later, then it will be less useful. And what I mean with that is this camera started shipping about 2 weeks ago in Europe, and it started shipping in America this week. We are now talking about the beginning of May 2023. And I'm assuming that many people are searching for overheating issues when this camera is coming out. That always happens, and I figured if you're interested in this camera or you just got it, that more info about this topic is useful. There will be some fixes or hints or whatever you want to call it on how to handle the issue, but within limits. Do I have experience with this? Well, if you search on this channel, you will find that 7 years ago, I started using Sony cameras, and by then I was also recording quite long. And you will find that I've made many hacks, fixes, whatever you want to call it, 6 and 7 years ago for the A6000, which we are still using. It's actually the top camera, this one. And for the A6500, which is actually the camera which you're looking at there, behind the video prompter. So I do have quite a lot of experience. And I made the weirdest solutions ever, including little fans behind the camera, which is now also being sold for different camera brands. I've made a battery for inside the A6000 line that had a fan in it. So I do have some experience in this case. So the first thing I'm going to tell you, there is no magic bullet. But there are things that you can do, and I'm already into testing the ZV-E1 up to a point that I have a feeling of where we are going. But like I said, if I make this in a month or in 2 months, it will probably not be as useful in your buying decisions or in your way of thinking about it. So I will give some general information and then what I already tested and what worked and what didn't work. So just to start off, the reason I got a ZV-E1 is basically to be a parent or a partner to my bigger camera. So for example, here we have the Sony A1 camera, I think with the same lens on it. Yeah, so the same lens. Well, not the same as a 2.8, but it's 16-35. Yeah, you'll see a pretty big beefy body. If you also look at it from this side, it's clearly in a different format and size. Let me put it away again. Well, this one has the power zoom, also 16. I got a GM on there, sorry, 40mm GM on there. I can tell you that the power zoom is even a little bit smaller. Yeah, that will definitely be and was for me one of the reasons to get it. Now, as a result, since the camera is smaller, is not fully made of metal, and much lighter as a result, which is a good thing, it also will overheat easier if you ask it to do the same job that the bigger cameras are doing. So either the one with the fans, like the FX3, or the one which have a bigger body, so like the A7S III, which is basically, let's say, the body of this camera. In some areas, this camera is doing even more. There's more processing power, but the sensor is the same. They all use the 48 megapixels and then wired back into a 12 megapixels sensor, which we love. So that's it's in 4 or 5 cameras now. So it's quite powerful, but it is in a much smaller body, and so it will overheat if you push it. So let's talk about what that means, because you will see that for some people it will never overheat, for other people it will always overheat. So where is this balance? Let's be practical. If you are putting this camera outside in the sun, you're basically putting a small black little brick into the sun. It will soak up heat, whatever camera brand it is. It will overheat without any active cooling. So that's one thing. Why doesn't it overheat for somebody? Well, let's assume you are in Greece and you're on one of the Greek islands. Then there is always a little bit of wind. It's almost impossible to be there without a little bit of a windy surroundings. That means there's airflow behind the LCD, which should definitely turn out, which is true for any Sony camera. In fact, I would argue for most cameras. If there's a little bit of airflow, it helps an amazing amount. If you put it in the shade, and it could be as easy as putting a small cap on top of it or an umbrella above the camera, which makes sense if you're doing long recordings anyway, because, well, then you can see the LCD. So there are simple sort of tricks that you can do that help. That's one argument, right? So there's always a range on where it overheats. So all the Sony cameras have a setting called high temperature allowance, and they allow the camera to become hotter. Now many people, I will try to give as much information as I can here. Many people think, well, that just means that the camera will be damaged more easy. No, that has nothing to do with the camera. It actually has to do with your hands. So Sony built this in to stop something called slow burn. And slow burn means that if you are holding something which is semi-hot in your hands, that it can have a bad effect on your skin. And it's called slow burn. And just for safety, they put this option in there. So it's not actually to save the camera, it's to save your hands. So turning that off makes perfect sense. And now also when you install this camera, ask you in the beginning if you want to turn this on or off. So turn it off if you plan to use it in a circumstance where it might overheat, and then put it on a tripod or whatever you want to do. But keep in mind that it's not to protect the camera, it's to protect your hands. So that's one thing you should do. Also, of course, flip the camera out, the LCD out, so like this, well, in case you're stupid, like this, so that this area becomes quite hot, is in clear air. The same, so if you're talking about where it heats up, it's mostly here, and I found with this camera also here. So there are already some changes on this camera compared to the older models. The older models, they used to be the battery compartment. I will get back to that. And also the flash card would be here, and that would be something that overheats. Maybe for this reason they put the flash card on this side in this case, because that's clearly not a problem anymore. The battery I will get back to, because that is, well, slightly a problem or a solution. So, did I already do a long recording? Yes, but only within a certain limit. So one thing I was interested in is not to be able to record like 3 hours just when I'm outside, because I don't think this camera is meant for it. But I was interested in the feature which they put in there, which is webcam mode. So they improved the webcam mode and also added 4K 25. And they made special note of it that it now supports 4K 25 at 30 FPS. I found that interesting. So the first thing that I wanted to know, well, does that actually work? The bad news, no. It depending on which mode you're in. Mine, again, there's 22 degrees, no airflow. It did overheat if I put it on 4K 60, 4K 50 also, but I will get back to that. After about 40 minutes to 45 minutes. Now, that will depend basically on your room temperature, but also maybe on the luck of the camera that you get. I've had multiple APC cameras, and some of them just go a little bit earlier, and some of them go a little bit longer. It also depends on the firmware. Now, I'm pretty sure that the next firmware update will improve this. Why am I saying this? Well, for two reasons. The first reason is it always happens, and let me also explain it a little bit as a software and hardware engineer. The firmware which is now on there will have some debug code there. It will have some things that are not optimized yet. That's just how firmware teams work. After a while, they figure out better tricks and they can remove some debug code, and they will release a point something release. It's the same thing that you always notice if you have a Sony camera, that they say stability upgrades and other improvements. For example, we always see a little bit of improvement on the AF performance. Fully expect this on this camera. That does not mean that they are going to bring out a fix for overheating. They won't. But it will become better simply because they are optimizing. Optimizing means less performance. Less performance is needed means less heat, etc., etc. So just the process of optimizing the camera in the first few small software releases means that most likely it will get better in the overheating department. Also, and that's also quite a big one, they already give a hint that they are going to release the 120 frames per second at 4K later, so in June. To me, there's also a hint that they are not happy and they are still tuning the firmware in a way that makes 120 4K possible. I fully expect it to be time limited, like 10 minutes or something. But as a result of making that work, I'm again pretty sure that they are looking into optimizing the general setup of the camera. And that means that lesser speeds, like full HD or 4K 25, might be improving quite a lot. So that's also what makes this video a little bit difficult, because it depends on so many different factors, right? Because in the end, it's all about how much heat does the camera generate and how much heat can it transport to the outside world on a continuous basis. And that's a balance, right? So the first thing I did is put it on in this webcam mode and put it on 4K 60 and 4K 25. Both situations overheated at about 40 minutes, which didn't make me too happy. So the first thing that I did is I replaced the battery with a dummy plug, which kind of makes sense if you want to use this for long recordings like a webcam, or you want to use this as a long recording like recording your, I don't know, theater or something. Again, I don't think this is the perfect camera for that. But for webcam, clearly they are advertising it, so it should be able to do that. Having an external battery power, so with a dummy plug, is a good thing. As a result, I also keep the door open, like this, just because I'm lazy, and if the cable is coming out, there is now a hole in here, again, which I don't like, because that stops water ingress, in my opinion, this hole, but, well, it is. But I always leave the door open when I'm using this, because it's easier also. I tested with that, and again, yeah, it depends how you look at it, good or bad news. That actually didn't change the situation that much. I would say about 10%, at least in my test, 10% extra time was added. So in this case, the battery, like with the old models, that's why I built a battery with a fan in there, and the flash card is not the sensor that is tripping. So what most likely is when you get this heat message, is first it reaches the point where it gives the heat warning, and then here's the point where it decides to shut off. I'm 99% sure, and if you really want to know, watch my videos of 6 or 7 years ago, that on the APS-C older cameras, it was the sensor near to the flash card that actually said, oh, no more, let's shut it down, because I'm getting overheated. But in this case, it does not look like a dummy battery or the flash card is the problem. My guess is simply on the temperature that I'm feeling. It's much more the main processor over here or on the back over here. So maybe somebody put a thermal camera on there and we can see. I have no idea. So yeah, so what did work for me? Well, basically lowering the resolution, and this sounds like an obvious thing, but it's quite tricky. Because I first made a mistake, which was just me being stupid, but it gave us a lot of information. My guess is if it internally still needs to record 4K, so all the modes that required you to have 4K and then scale back will probably be in the area where it might overheat. So what do I mean with this? So I put the camera onto 4K 25, but I streamed out because there's a different setting, the streaming to a USB setting. I put that on full HD. So then it's still overheated. It took a little bit longer, but it's still overheated. And the reason for that is even in standby, that's also why it's overheating for people when they're just in standby or using the menus, is because basically it's doing all the processing anyway. So in the camera is doing the processing all the way up to the end step, and that's the heat is generated anyway. So you really have to tune it in the beginning of the process and not at the end. Now, what is happening if you're using the HDMI or the USB out, there's a special second chip that actually downscales what the camera is doing. So what do I mean? If I put it on 4K 25, for example, It will do the whole thing in 4K 25, so all the 48 megapixels, bringing it back to 12 megapixels, bringing that back to your 4K image, doing lens compensation, whatever, and all the other trick. It does that in the higher quality before it sends it to the chip, which actually downscales it again, also an important part, to the output that we requested on either the HDMI or on the USB-C. Now, that means that it has to convert it twice, right? So first it has to figure out a 12 megapixel or 48 in this case, because that's what the sensor does. It does some magic on the sensor, then it needs to do some magic to make the normal video work, and then it has to, once it gets to the HDMI chip or the USB-C chip, probably the same chip, it still needs to downscale it to what we asked for as an output signal to our computer or our HDMI device. Now, that was a mistake I made. I put it internally on 4K, but externally already streamed it at 1080. It also tells you on the back of the camera that it's in 1080 streaming. It doesn't give you a hint anymore that it's in 4K. So make sure that you put it in full HD if you want to use this mode before you go and stream also in HD. Personally, I think this camera is much more comfortable and sensible if you're using it for, let's say, Skype or Zoom or another online activity. I think it's the perfect HD camera. I'm not convinced that it's a perfect 4K camera, although I said I'm making this video early and I will make several, because I will do some more testing and I will also try to add some external solutions. But like I said, I wanted to give you a little bit of information already. I think it's much better as an HD solution, because all the interesting tricks like the breathing compensation, the stabilization, the auto framing features that it has, actually I think makes more sense that you're using a 4K, or in this case 12 megapixels, to get 2 megapixels to play around with. Right, so I think this is much more interesting use of this camera. So I would suggest that for streaming activity and for long recordings, HD is probably a way nicer solution than 4K. And like I argued before in some of these videos, I think 4K was mostly done by many YouTubers to be able to crop in post. And I think some of the tricks that they are now built into the camera is actually sort of negating that step. So not trying to argue that, oh, just use the camera in HD and then it will be fine, because it isn't. But, and I'm also not claiming that you can't get it to work in 4K. I'm just saying I think that's an interesting, more interesting area of this camera. So in this HD mode, did it also overheat? Yes. But within an unpredictable range. So what do I mean with this? So I put it in this webcam mode over USB, put it in 1080, 25 frames a second, display still on high, but flipped out of course, using a dummy battery, which I don't think affects the result, but otherwise you can't record that long anyway, and put it in webcam mode and turned on QuickTime on my Mac and let it go for a while. So it went totally fine for 2 hours. So I figured it was stable. But after 2 hours I got the overheating warning, but it was flickering. And it was flickering so much that it was on the edge. So it was on the lower edge of the warning, not yet the overheating yet. I've not seen it overheat in the full HD, but it was kind of in flickering to the warning point. So how do I know this? Because if I went on behind the camera with a little bit of paper and I flipped around it a little bit, so it created a tiny bit of wind flow. I did that for about 10-15 seconds. The warning went away and it stayed away for half an hour. So that tells us that even on the back, providing the slightest amount of wind, hint, that's what the FX3 is doing and some of the external solutions for Panasonic, for example, are doing, is creating a tiny bit of airflow. I should turn this out, I guess. A tiny bit of airflow behind the camera is already enough to create a way for it to dissipate heat. Because that's what it's all about, right? It also explains that if you're outside, not in the sun, but it's in the shade and it's quite warm, but it has some airflow, like again on the Greek islands, then it will not overheat on you. So that's interesting. So I just saw this pop up, and I actually did it 2 or 3 times, where it turned on back to the warning point. I simply for 10 seconds, and it went away for 15 minutes. So the thing what I did then is I left it in this warning mode and see if it would continue to overheat until it shut down. Now this camera in my room, which was 22 degrees Celsius, with no airflow, but open of course, it never really overheated. It stayed within this warning signal range for over 3 hours. So I did 3 hours as a webcam simulation, and it worked fine for that. So that's kind of the point where I'm at now. So I had probably about 8 or 9 total hours of overheating tests. One successful overheating test where it went for 3 hours and I just stopped it. Because I think it's smart to make this video now and then update a video later to explain what I've learned in later phases. So one thing I'm going to try next is try to see if it overheats if you are using what I think is a very interesting mode, the reframing mode in full HD. So put it in full HD still, but then use the reframing feature that you can move around and it automatically sort of follows you. Because I think that's also a very interesting one, both for a long time recording on a distance, like a recital or something, but especially in webcam mode. I also wonder, and I will test that, if some of the heat, let me turn it around, actually depends on the lens. So this is a quite a metal lens. It's the GM lens, 14mm, which is a brilliant lens, one of the better lenses for this. But I wonder if you're using the 16-35 power zoom, which is not a really good lens for this, that's more plasticky. And also this part gets hot. And I'm really wondering how much of the heat dissipation is going through the lens. We don't know for sure. So again, one of these variables where you just don't know for sure. So the other thing I'm going to work on is I already ordered some parts. And I know this sounds weird, but you have to see everything in context, right? If you want to use this camera and you don't want to pay for an FX3, which is way more expensive but has a built-in fan, or you don't want to limit yourself to a reasonable time frame, I will try to put a fan in here, and I will probably follow a little bit of the design of the Panasonic, which sells you, Panasonic itself, a module that you can put here that you can actually put a fan there. So I ordered a USB powered 40mm fan, and I will attach it here just to see if a tiny bit of airflow is actually a solution. I would not be surprised that it is. Now, does this always make sense? No, it's a hack, no doubt about it. But if you want to use it as a webcam, it's a very comfortable hack. It's not something that is that weird. If you want to use it normally only for 5 minutes or for 10 minutes, but you have 2 times that you really want to use this to do a long recording, as a second camera that you leave on or whatever, then again, it's a totally acceptable solution to get the small fan for this. Now, what I will do, and I'm not sure yet if Small Rig is open for this. If you look at my channel, you'll find that I have lots of Small Rig stuff. I help them design at certain points on different parts, and I also want them to design several things for this. Now, they're already working on a full cage, which by the way might also help, simply because there's more metal and it can get air away. But I want to keep mine really small, so I want them to just design a base plate for this. But again, that might already help a little bit in the heat dissipation. But I also want that they leave, I'm hoping that they are willing to make a magnet system where I can actually click on this fan part, if that makes sense, with a nice sort of inner form. So what I am going to ask them to do is create about 9mm base plate, which has Arca in it, which is also important because this hole is in a kind of a strange place. So I want to have Arca plates, but also some holes that you can still put it on a bracket, or you can still put it on your webcam point. So I definitely want to have a new ground plate, but I wanted them to design in the ground plate, basically at the bottom, two iron pots or little iron ridge in there, so that in the part that I am going to ask them to make for me is the same similar thing that Panasonic has, that you can actually click it on. And the idea here will be that you can kind of click this fan onto the magnets, and you can just ploop, pop it on, and ploop, remove it again. Again, do I think this is a solution for everybody? No. Do I think people are going to make fun of this video? Yep, they always have. Will this work? Yes, I think it will most likely work. I will confirm that a few days after some more testing and show you. I think this can be designed, and I think this might be an interesting extra feature for people who want to use this basically as a cheap FX3 or a cheap or update to the FX30, depends how you want to look at it. And they don't want to have the size and the cost of a A7S3, right? Because it is quite a lot cheaper. And in many areas it does exactly the same thing. Let me think if I want to say more about this. No, like I said, I'm making this video early and it's still already quite long. It's about half an hour already. So that I can take you with me on this journey in trying to get this camera to, let's say it carefully, work above what they designed it for. Because I'm pretty sure, especially when these firmware updates come, which I'm pretty sure will do what I suspect, that you can start to misuse it, and I'm saying this on purpose like this, misuse it for longer recording as if it was an FX3 or it was a bigger body like the A7S3 or for that case the A1, right? Which is also over-engineered to do 8K. That means that if you ask it to do 4K, it's like, well, sure, we can do that. But it's totally designed for that. And this one simply isn't. It's too small of a body. And if you ask it to do this amount of processing, at least in 2023, and you push it into this area where it can't get away the heat from the body to the ambient, it will overheat. So, yeah, that's about it. Hopefully you don't feel too cheated if you're still listening after half an hour. I'm pretty sure you are not. By my title that I say, hey, this is how you stop the overheating. But I think it was important to get people into this discussion and that we can work on it together. Because I think the reviewers, I'm not saying they did it on purpose, but there's always this balance, right? They are using it maybe even hand-picked or at least units that are turned out to be less prone to overheating during their reviews, which is not their fault. Also the way they were using it, they were outside in probably a little bit of wind gush, also makes perfect sense. But that's why we see these totally different results. So I don't blame them in any way, but I do think now that these cameras get into the hands of real users, and that we can start fiddling around with what actually can be done with it, and how much can you, and again I'm going to call it misuse, how much can you misuse the camera for something that it was not really designed for. Now I'm pretty sure there will be people say, oh, just get a Panasonic or just do a GH6 or whatever, or any other camera which has a much smaller sensor, which is not doing as much processing, it doesn't have all the lenses that you already own. So I think it's a non-discussion. There is enough cameras in the Sony range that don't overheat. If you decide to pick this one up and you are using it within, let's say, out of spec area, then you must be willing to fiddle around with possible solutions. And hopefully you'll find in this video or in following videos that I'm joining you in trying to figure out what is actually the perfect solution. So thank you for watching, and I will keep you updated in the next video. Let me know in the comments the ideas about, for example, the bracket I was talking about, or any other tricks that you already have found, or any other limitations you already have found. Let me know in the video. The next video I'm going to make, and look back because I already made one about the photo mode, because you're missing so many dials, that I already I made one about how to set it up for video, for photo, compared to the, again, to the A1, which has like many more dials and buttons. So how can you kind of work around this? I'm almost done in figuring out how I think it might be a good setup for video. So the next video will be either about auto framing, which I think also deserves a video, or about the buttons for the video setup. So yeah, subscribe and follow, and let's see how far we can push this overheating story. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next one. Bye bye.